So at first, this could actually feel phenomenal. And you've heard people get into this like state of nirvana, right? And they're in this low carb, like mental clarity. You'll hear people talk about where you have energy and you're alert and even euphoric. But that's, a lot of times adrenaline is doing that. Cortisol is doing the heavy lifting at this point. Hello and welcome back to the Weaponized Body podcast. My name is Dr. Ryan Hewitt, and as always, I am here to talk to you about an important topic when it comes to metabolic movement and mindset. And today I'm talking about something that is very controversial, something that a lot of us have heard a ton about and perhaps practiced and have had friends and family that have talked about this in practice, which are called low-carb diets. I myself have been in low-carb diets before. I've tried low carb diets. I use it as a strategy when I'm trying to lean out. Naturally, your carbohydrate intake, you're going to want to bring that down. Some people really thrive with low carb diets. Others do not. Others think they are thriving in a low carb diet, but end up in big trouble. And what I found is a lot of people actually end up in this place when you're practicing a low carb diet for way too long. So the thing that used to help you lose fat, sharpen your focus, it actually starts to tear you down over time. It starts to fuck up your hormones, your thyroid, your electrolytes, and ultimately your performance. So when you think you're becoming more disciplined by really sucking up the grind of low carb, well, what happens is over time, you can actually down-regulate your metabolism, shrink your anabolic hormones, and really just screw up all of the environment that is useful for building muscle. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to break down some of the science, sprinkle in a little bit of some of the studies that I've, poured over, try to break this down as simply as possible so you can understand, hopefully cut through some of the noise with all the bullshit out there when it comes to low carb diets. And especially when it comes to the blood work, here's really what you want to look for. So the first thing we'll talk about is thyroid. This is one of the most common dysfunctions that I observe and I witness when going over blood work with athletes, with general public who have been on low carb diets for a long time, usually to lose weight. And here's what almost nobody tells you. When you go low carb for months on end, your thyroid will take a hit. That's why a lot of symptoms that you'll see with people over time that are in keto, their hands are cold, they have low energy, they start dragging ass, they get brain fog. What used to be mental clarity turns into brain fog. And the craziest thing is your labs from a thyroid perspective could look quote unquote fine. In other words, your thyroid stimulating hormone could look fantastic, sticking to that range between like 1 and 3. The problem with that is the thyroid stimulating hormone is not the only hormone that you want to test when it comes to your thyroid health. What can actually happen is your metabolism could tank while your TSH could remain in the normal range. Here's why. Carbohydrates, they actually help drive what's called insulin, right? I think a lot of people understand that. Your pancreas creates insulin in response to carbohydrate intake to help drive glucose into your cells, but also the hormone leptin, right, which is the satiety hormone. So those two signals tell your liver actually to convert inactive, what's called T4, made in your thyroid, to the active form of thyroid hormone called T3. That conversion happens in your liver, and it is driven by things like insulin and leptin. What happens is you produce less T3, and what happens with that T3, it converts to what's called reverse T3, which is an inert or inactive form of T3, which actually can block receptors. So you've got a perfect storm of like the TSH looking normal and the T4 looking normal, but the gas pedal, or in other words, the T3 is actually suppressed. So studies out there have shown this very clearly. Actually, I looked for one that really showed this. Is from the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, that found that just 2 weeks on a zero carb diet cut T3 nearly in half, while reverse T3 rose sharply. There's a bunch of studies out there. You can see this mechanism happening. So here's the thing, before you really see it take its toll, you can feel fatigue, cold hands, as I mentioned, brain fog, slow recovery, and you can even see things like hair and nails start to get brittle, weight loss, stalled weight loss. So it's not that like your physiology is broken. It's just that your body is trying to conserve energy in these situations, and your body will do whatever it takes. It'll slow you down. It'll stop you from moving so much. It'll downregulate your body temp. Your body is a phenomenal energy conserving organism. Let's talk about cortisol. A lot of people know the word cortisol. Cortisol is produced in your adrenals. It is a stress hormone. It is essential for life. It helps mobilize energy. In other words, it's a catabolic hormone. Now, when your glycogen is low for too long, in other words, if your blood sugar is too low for too long, your body can kind of get into a panic. So what happens is it does lean on cortisol, one of the survival hormones, as I mentioned, to keep your blood sugar up through a mechanism called gluconeogenesis. In other words, gluco is sugar, neo is new, genesis is basically the making of it. So it can actually, your body can make its own blood sugar, okay, from things like muscle tissue, amino acids, or from fat, right? So from triglyceride. So at first, this could actually feel phenomenal. And you've heard people get into this like state of nirvana, right? And they're in this low carb, like mental clarity. You'll hear people talk about where you have energy and you're alert and even euphoric. But that's, a lot of times adrenaline is doing that. Cortisol is doing the heavy lifting at this point. So if you stay here long enough, you're just creating chronic stress physiology. And the evidence of this is you get a drop in what's called DHEA, which is an upstream hormone that turn into androgen hormones like testosterone and estrogen. What happens is your sleep quality can start to go in the shitter, and you're not recovering, you're not resetting your insulin. You start waking up in the night. Okay. In other words, if you have a pattern of waking up frequently at night, a lot of times it's not just because you have to pee, but it's because you're getting cortisol spikes in the night. It's called tired and wired. It's not necessarily like overtraining, but it's underfueling in this case. There's studies out there that show this, right? The Journal of Clinical Investigation published a study that showed carbohydrate deprivation triggers adaptive cortisol rise. And that's independent of total calories. You don't have to be in a calorie deficit to see this. So that's why a lot of people that they try to lift weights and build muscle, and they can't build muscle and they feel flat despite eating enough protein. In a lot of cases, you're not eating enough carbohydrate, right? Cortisol just shreds muscle when your glycogen stores are perpetually empty. Now let's talk about other hormones such as testosterone. We'll talk about sex hormone binding globulin, etc. So we talked about how clearly low carb diets lower insulin. That's a no-brainer. It sounds good until you realize that like insulin suppression actually suppresses sex hormone binding globulin. Okay. When insulin disappears, it increases sex hormone binding globulin. Okay. So in other words, when insulin disappears, SHBG goes way up. And I've seen this in labs a lot. And it happens with people that are under eating, but especially under eating carbohydrate. Here's the problem with that is sex hormone binding globulin binds to androgen hormones such as testosterone. When it binds to your testosterone, it becomes unavailable. Therefore, what it does is it reduces an important biomarker called free testosterone. That's the usable shit that androgen receptors can use in order to have the benefits of hormones like testosterone. And here's the crazy thing. Your total testosterone could look solid on paper, but the deal is your free T is going to be in the shitter. Okay, same thing with estradiol. Your estradiol could actually kind of look good, but the varieties of estradiol that are most beneficial, right, the derivatives are going to be suppressed. Lots of studies out there that show this too, that confirm low insulin increases sex hormone binding globulin. You can look that up on PubMed. There's lots of clinical studies as well as randomized trials. So you'll see this clinically, symptomatically in things like low libido, strength going down, poor recovery. You'll see it in flat mood, maybe even like depressive symptoms, right? So, having more bouts of depression, etc. So in a lot of cases, it's because of chronic undereating. of an important macronutrient called carbohydrates. Let's talk about how this affects your lipids. And I see this a lot. I have countless cases that I've seen folks that have been practicing a keto diet whose cholesterol rises sharply. Now, it's a very controversial topic, cholesterol. Now, there are some things that are widely accepted as problems, though, when it comes to cholesterol. It's not necessarily the total cholesterol that is an independent risk factor. It's not even necessarily the LDL or bad cholesterol total that is a problem in that case, okay, because those do go up in keto diets typically, including HDL, which are your quote unquote good cholesterol. But what we want to watch for are indications of elevations of things like ApoB, okay, or LDL particle sizes becoming too small, and also things like vascular inflammation. So that's no bueno. That increases your risk of cardiovascular disease. And there are some folks that are more susceptible to this. There are genetic tests such as ApoE genotypes. If you're an ApoE genotype who is a E4, for example, these folks happen to be hyper absorbers of cholesterol. So if you're eating a diet that is rich in cholesterol, you're going to absorb the hell out of this. You're going to have lipid problems. E4s tend to do better on moderate to lower fat diets and moderate to, increased or higher carbohydrate diets, while protein remaining, mid to high. So, if you're increasing a lot of your cardio risk factors while trying to do something good for your health, like, cut carbs, you're shooting yourself in the foot. You can absolutely lose weight other ways than cutting carbohydrates. So like if your LDL cholesterol is jumping to, over 250 and your ApoBs are over 120, you've got a big problem there. And it's not that you're broken. It's just that you're practicing something you probably shouldn't do for a long period of time. Now, here's something interesting about low carb diets over time is it can actually deplete electrolytes. Everyone knows, electrolytes are essential for life. A lot of people are putting electrolytes in their water. They feel better. They feel more hydrated and fueled. But when your insulin drops, your kidneys stop retaining sodium. That's the problem. It's not that you're not intaking enough electrolytes. Is that if your insulin's too low, your body's not going to retain any sodium. And what it does is it takes water, potassium, and magnesium with it when the sodium is chronically leaving the body. So if you're eating a ketogenic diet, for example, each ketone molecule that exits the body is paired with sodium, potassium, or magnesium to balance the charge. So you're leaking minerals through your urine, and this is why this happens. This is well documented. This is something that is well observed as well. So when people tell you to just add salt, that's not a bad recommendation, but they're missing the why, right? It's not the salt. It's the missing insulin signal that once told your kidneys to hang on to it. There's also other vitamin and phytonutrient deficiencies that can happen. So a lot of times when you're demonizing carbohydrates, people are cutting stuff like fruits, vegetables. They're cutting things, like root vegetables, colorful plants. And over time, that means lower doses of phytonutrients that you're not going to get necessarily from meat. Vitamin C, K1, folate, potassium, antioxidants. I get it. That stuff's in organ meats. Barely anybody's eating organ meats. There's lots of evidence that, accelerated aging, higher inflammation, weaker immune responses can happen, from phytonutrient deficiencies. And the irony is people will go low carb to reduce inflammation, but when you're on it too long, it literally does the opposite. So gut health is another gripe I have with low carb diets over time, like chronic eating of low carb diets. So if you didn't know, your probiotics in your gut, they feed on prebiotics. Guess where you get prebiotics from? Fiber. Okay. Where do you get fiber from? Fruits, vegetables, roots, tubers, all that kind of stuff. Good bacteria feed on that stuff. So your bifido and lactobacilli bacteria start dying off. Tons of papers will show this. Cell Metabolism paper in 2020 showed that within 2 weeks of carb restriction, beneficial gut species decline while inflammatory markers increase. So less fiber means lower prebiotic, which are short chain fatty acids that feed your colon. So it's not that low carb diets don't work for weight loss, but you also lost your internal ecosystem that keeps your inflammation low and your hormones balanced. So robbing Peter to pay Paul in a way. Here's another thing I've observed with people that have practiced low carb diets for too long is they become intolerant to glucose. So when you try to start refeeding glucose after being so low carb for so long, they try to reintroduce sugar, right? Carbohydrate. And what happens is blood sugar just absolutely skyrockets. And when blood sugar skyrockets, you feel awful. Okay. And what happens is your body's just deconditioned to carbohydrate intake because you've down-regulated all the transporters and enzymes, right? That feed insulin receptors and muscle because you never use them. So glucose enters your body and your body is terrible at using it. Right. It's just it's not used to using incredible amounts of glucose. So it takes a while to retrain your body to be able to utilize the sugar. So you didn't become insulin resistant. You just became glucose intolerant. Okay. There's a big difference there. I like to talk about the hormone IGF-1. This is a hormone your body makes in response to growth hormone. Okay. It's growth hormone's converted in the liver. And what happens is it creates something called IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor. And this is where growth occurs in the body. This is where all the good stuff comes from, right? This is how muscle repair occurs. It aids in things like, collagen and tendon health. And it's like an anti-aging hormone, your skin, your nails, your hair. So what happens is your insulin, what happens is it partners with growth hormone to produce IGF-1. It's part of the process. If you have no carbs, you have no insulin, and you have low IGF-1. And this is documented through studies that low IGF-1 means shitty recovery, less muscle, slower healing. And it's not that like, oh my God, I need a peptide to boost my growth, my IGF-1. It's, well, no, maybe you have to stop eating low carb for so long, refeed carbohydrate, bump up your your insulin and increase your IGF-1. So there's all kinds of studies in the Journal of Applied Physiology that document this. Keto athletes have like 20 to 30% lower IGF-1, which reduces muscle protein synthesis. So my saying is you can't build a weaponized body if you've turned off your growth signals, whether that's you're not lifting weights, you're not eating a protein-based whole food diet, you're not sleeping properly. Those are essential for building muscle. The chronic stress patterns of like an overtrained, underfed look are a result of this chronic carbohydrate restriction. So if you put all this together, everything I've just talked about, you're looking at low T3, which is active thyroid. You're looking at high cortisol. You're looking at low DHEA. You're looking at low free testosterone and low IGF-1. What does that look like? That looks like someone that starts blaming old age by the time they're 35 or 40 years old, right? And your blood work will show all of this. And I've seen these patterns and I can identify this stuff like, dude or ma'am, you have been chronically under eating. You've been chronically under fueling, especially from, with carbohydrates. And it leads to an overtrained, underfed physiology and pattern. Okay. And you think you're doing everything right and you're so disciplined and you're working so freaking hard and you're not building muscle and you feel weak and you feel like ass and you feel like you're not recovered when you wake up in the morning. The thing is you're just metabolically misaligned, right? You don't have a calorie problem. In a lot of cases, you don't have a training problem. You don't have like a, supplement problem. It's just that your macros are fucked up. Okay. So when we look at things like going low carb for too long, things like your IGF-1 and testosterone stay down, which are also essential for bone formation, okay, and blood red cell production. So you can actually see things like anemia, low ferritin, even like osteopenia in some cases, especially with women. So if you're brittle, cold, tired, it's not aging. It's just like hormonal fallout from, chronic carb starvation. Which can feel like accelerated aging, right? So like long-term carb restriction can lower antioxidant intake, which actually reduces glutathione too, which is the master antioxidant in your body. right? It raises oxidative stress, in fact. So your mitochondrial health actually slows down. It's actually been shown by science that things like your telomeres shorten, which are on your DNA. So that's actually one of the biomarkers they use to measure aging, and your cellular repair suffers. So you hear me like bashing low carb diets for doing all this shitty stuff. Now, listen, there's a time and place for low carb diets. Again, I want to just preface by saying, like, I'm not here just to trash low carb diets and say never do it, because there's people listening. They're like, fuck this guy. Like, I've been doing low carb diets. I feel great. I perform awesome. Like, I'm crushing it. Awesome. Whatever. If you're doing it, it's working for you. Awesome. You keep doing it. I always caution people though, like, if you're doing this for months and years, like, there is burnout happening. Okay. I see this with people that do vegan diets as well. Some of the most deficient diets on the planet are vegan diets. And what happens is, like, you can feel great and look good and perform well on a vegan diet for a long time, especially if you're doing it really well. But the thing is, like, chronic deficiencies, chronic stressors that don't break you down overnight, they break you down little by little over time. That creates, overall, it takes a while for the symptoms to show up. And if you're not doing your blood work routinely, you're not going to catch this stuff. So there's a time and a place for low carb diets. I think the smart thing to do is to cycle your carbs, right? That there are things you need to do to lose weight sustainably. Okay. One of them is you do have to reduce your calories. One of the things is you absolutely have to build muscle, okay, to increase your metabolic furnace. And if you're chronically low in carbs, you're not going to build muscle. It's going to be much, much harder. So you want to earn your carbs. Just hear me say that. Earn your carbs through movement and training. Okay. You got to feed your thyroid. You got to feed your testosterone. You got to feed the recovery. So here's where I see most people do pretty well, is eating, like, for men, for example, like 100 to 150 grams of carbs a day. It's very rare that I'll pull anybody under 100 grams of carbs per day. Okay, there's like some circumstances that we will, again, I'm not saying every single person. Everybody's individualized, everyone's special. But things like fruit, roots, tubers, shoots, all that kind of stuff, potatoes, rice, like, those are fantastic sources of real carbs, carbs that are full of fiber, phytonutrients, stuff that's going to feed your good bacteria, stuff that's going to, replenish your glycogen from when you beat yourself up through training. And you want to make sure you're refeeding these carbohydrates, from time to time. You can go low carb for a bit, then refeed carbs. You can do this. You can cycle carbs during the week. You can cycle carbs around harder training. However you do it, you want to make sure you continue to re-signal your insulin, re-signal your hunger hormones. Okay, keep your sex hormone binding globulin in check to keep your testosterone high. So you don't need to quit keto, but what you want to make sure is you're not living there forever. Okay, and I know that can be terrifying for some people, especially if you've been successful in losing weight with keto. What you want to do is ease out of it and make sure you're going, in and out. Okay, find a sustainable place to be. And I always, always, always stress, make sure you are building muscle. That's how you're going to make weight loss sustainable. So the thing is, like, discipline without this intelligent deep dive into what's going on under the hood is like just a surefire way to get to destruction. So your body's not, something to punish. It's a weapon, right? So if you want to weaponize it, you got to fuel it intelligently. And I wanted to make sure I exposed some of the truths about chronic low carb diets, right? And if this hits you hard, make sure that you reach out, ask some questions. Okay. Make sure you're an N equals 1 experiment. Try new things, right? Make sure that you're doing your research before you take on any sort of like training program, nutritional approach. Okay. Because the truth is, if you can't perform really well if you're chronically underfueling, and especially if you're chronically underfueling carbs for months and years on end. So I hope this was valuable. I love this topic. Love to hear from you guys. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, share, subscribe. Love you guys, and I'll see you next week.